Something strange is happening right now with the United States and Iran, and the more you look at it, the less it makes sense on the surface. The President of the United States is standing in front of cameras telling the American people that things are going well, that the US is getting very close to meeting its goals, and that he is thinking about winding down military operations. That sounds like good news. That sounds like a leader who has a plan and is executing it. That sounds like the kind of announcement that should bring relief to millions of Americans who are watching this situation unfold with genuine concern. But here is the problem. At the exact same time that those words are coming out of the White House, the Pentagon is doing something completely different. The military is not winding down. The military is building up. More forces are being moved into position, more strike packages are being planned, more assets are being positioned in the region. The military posture is not relaxing, it is tightening. So you have the commander-in-chief saying wind down and the military he commands doing the opposite. And that gap, that space between what the president is saying publicly and what the Pentagon is actually doing on the ground, that is the story. That is what we need to talk about today, because this is not just a contradiction. This is a window into something much bigger. It tells you about the nature of this conflict, the strategy behind it, the political pressures surrounding it, and where this whole situation might be heading in the weeks and months to come. And there is one thing specifically that almost nobody in the major media is connecting right now. A single thread that once you pull it makes everything about this situation make more sense. We are going to get to that. But first, we need to make sure we are all starting from the same place. Keep watching, because by the time this is done, you are going to understand this Iran situation in a way that most people who follow politics closely do not yet understand it. Not because the information is hidden, but because nobody has laid it all out in the right order with the right context. That is what we are going to do right now. Let's start with why this moment matters so much. The United States and Iran have been in a dangerous dance for decades. There have been moments of extreme tension, proxy conflicts, assassination attempts, nuclear negotiations, economic sanctions, and back-channel communications that most Americans never hear about. The relationship between Washington and Tehran is one of the most complex, layered, and consequential relationships in all of global politics. It shapes oil prices, it shapes the security of Israel. It shapes the stability of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It shapes global shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points in the entire world economy. When something significant happens between the United States and Iran, the ripple effects are not limited to the Middle East. They travel through energy markets, through defense budgets, through diplomatic relationships, through the calculations of every major power on Earth, including China and Russia. So, when the President of the United States starts making public statements about winding down military operations while the Pentagon continues expanding its footprint in the region, the world is paying very close attention. Allies are watching, adversaries are watching, markets are watching, and every government in the Middle East is trying to figure out what the real policy is, because right now the signals are genuinely confusing, and that confusion matters. Because confusion in this part of the world between these two countries has historically been one of the things that leads to miscalculation. And miscalculation in a conflict involving the United States and Iran in a region already full of armed groups and proxy forces and nuclear ambitions, is exactly the kind of thing that can spiral in directions nobody wants. That is why this story deserves serious, careful, fact-based analysis. Not panic, not partisan cheerleading, not cable news shouting, just a clear-eyed look at what is actually happening, what it means, and what might come next. So let us start with what actually happened. What did Trump say exactly, and when did he say it? What is the Pentagon actually doing? And how do those two things fit together or fail to fit together? The statements from President Trump about Iran being close to an agreement, about the U.S. nearing its goals, and about potentially winding down military operations came against a backdrop of weeks of escalating military activity. The United States had been conducting strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, which are Iranian-backed. There had been ongoing pressure campaigns related to Iran's nuclear program. There had been public and private warnings directed at Tehran about the consequences of continued aggression or nuclear advancement. And there had been a significant deployment of American military assets to the region, including carrier strike groups and additional air power. The strikes on Houthi positions in Yemen are part of a broader operational picture that the administration has been framing as direct pressure on Iran. The argument from Washington is that the Houthis are not an independent actor. They are an Iranian proxy. They receive weapons, training, intelligence, and strategic direction from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So when the U.S. bombs Houthi targets, the administration frames that as sending a message to Tehran. It is a form of indirect confrontation, a way of applying military pressure on Iran without directly striking Iranian soil. That distinction matters enormously, by the way. Striking an Iranian proxy in Yemen is a very different thing politically and militarily from striking Iran directly. It carries far less risk of triggering a direct Iranian military response against U.S. forces or allies. It gives Tehran an off-ramp. It allows Iran to absorb the pressure without being forced into a direct response that would require a major escalation. And it gives the administration the ability to say it is being tough on Iran while technically staying below the threshold that would most likely trigger a broader war. But that strategy only works if Iran reads the signals correctly, and that requires clarity. The signals have to be consistent, coherent, and credible. When the president is saying wind down and the Pentagon is saying build up, the signal being sent to Tehran is not clear. It is muddy, and a muddy signal to a government that is simultaneously under enormous economic pressure from sanctions, facing internal political instability, managing a nuclear program that is advancing further every month, and watching its regional proxies come under fire is a dangerous thing. Iran is not going to respond to ambiguity by choosing the most peaceful interpretation. Governments under pressure do not typically assume the best, they prepare for the worst. And Iran preparing for the worst means Iran doing things that could accelerate the very confrontation that the president says he wants to wind down. This is the strategic paradox at the heart of what is happening right now. And it is something the White House either does not fully appreciate or has decided to accept as a calculated risk. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about what the president actually means when he says the U.S. is getting close to its goals. Because goals need to be defined before you can evaluate whether you are close to meeting them. What are the American goals in this conflict? The administration has articulated several things over time. Stopping Iran's advancement toward a nuclear weapon, ending Iranian support for proxy groups that threaten U.S. allies and shipping, pressuring Iran economically through sanctions to change its behavior. Getting Iran back to a negotiating table for a new nuclear agreement on terms more favorable to the United States than the previous deal. Those are very different goals with very different timeframes and very different definitions of success. Stopping nuclear advancement is a military and intelligence goal. Ending proxy support is a political and military goal. Getting Iran to the table for a new deal is a diplomatic goal. And the tools required for each of those goals are not always compatible with each other. If you are bombing Iran's proxies to pressure Tehran, you may be making Iran less likely to come to a negotiating table, not more likely, because the domestic political pressure inside Iran after military strikes makes it very hard for Iranian leaders to be seen as making concessions to the country that just bombed their allies. National pride and political survival are powerful forces in Tehran just as they are in Washington. So when the president says we are getting close to our goals, the honest question is, which goals? All of them, some of them. And close in what way, by what measure? The administration has not provided specific, measurable answers to those questions publicly. And that matters because without clarity on what success looks like, it is very hard for anyone, including the American public, to evaluate whether the strategy is working. But here is the part almost nobody is talking about. The domestic political timeline for this conflict does not align neatly with the military or diplomatic timeline. The president faces political pressures at home that are completely separate from the strategic realities on the ground in the Middle East. There are members of his own political base who are deeply skeptical of prolonged military engagement abroad. There is a long-standing strand of political thought on the right that is skeptical of foreign wars and wants to see American military power used sparingly and with clear objectives. And there are economic pressures, including elevated energy prices, that military conflict in the Middle East tends to make worse. So the president has political incentives to project the image of someone who is successfully managing the Iran situation, who is close to achieving goals, and who is considering stepping back from military engagement. That narrative is politically useful regardless of whether the strategic situation on the ground actually supports it. That does not mean the president is lying. It means that the political incentives and the strategic realities may be pulling in different directions, and the public statements we are hearing reflect those competing pressures. Meanwhile, the Pentagon operates on a different logic. Military planners do not think in terms of news cycles or political optics. They think in terms of threat assessments, force posture requirements, operational objectives, and contingency planning. When the military is building up forces in the Middle East, even as the president talks about winding down, the most likely explanation is not that the military is ignoring the president. It is that military planners have assessed that the threat environment requires that posture, and they are maintaining operational readiness while the diplomatic and political situation remains unresolved. The military does not pack up and go home because a president floats the idea of winding down. It maintains readiness until there is a clear, verified, settled outcome that makes that posture unnecessary. That is how professional militaries operate. But the optics of that, the image of the commander-in-chief saying one thing while the military does another, creates a perception problem. And in the age of instant information, perception problems have real-world consequences. Let us talk about Iran's calculation right now, because understanding how Tehran is reading this situation is essential to understanding where things go from here. Iran is a country under enormous strain. The sanctions regime imposed by the United States has caused significant damage to the Iranian economy. Inflation has been severe. The Iranian currency has lost enormous value. Ordinary Iranians have suffered real hardship, and the government has faced waves of internal protest and dissent, most dramatically in the period following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022, but continuing in various forms since then. At the same time, Iran's nuclear program has advanced further than at any point in its history. International inspectors have documented that Iran is enriching uranium at levels that bring it very close to weapons-grade material. The time it would take Iran to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon has shortened dramatically. This is sometimes called the breakout time, and by most estimates that breakout time is now measured in weeks rather than months or years. This is a critical piece of context. The closer Iran gets to nuclear capability, the more urgent the pressure from the United States and Israel becomes. And the more urgent that pressure becomes, the higher the risk of a direct military confrontation. Israel has made absolutely clear repeatedly at the highest levels of government that it will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. That is not a negotiating position. That is a stated red line that the Israeli government has backed up with military action in the past, including strikes on nuclear facilities in Iraq and Syria. So Iran is navigating a situation where it faces massive economic pressure from sanctions, growing military pressure from U.S. strikes on its proxies, the constant threat of Israeli military action against its nuclear facilities, and internal political pressure from a population that is exhausted and angry after decades of isolation and hardship. In that environment, what does Iran do? It has a few options. It can negotiate, accepting a deal that limits its nuclear program and its regional activities in exchange for sanctions relief. It can accelerate its nuclear program, betting that getting to weapons capability before the US or Israel can stop it is the best form of deterrence. It can escalate through its proxies, raising the cost of confrontation for the United States and hoping to force a political settlement. Or it can wait, playing for time and hoping that political changes in Washington shift the pressure. Right now, Iran appears to be pursuing a combination of all four of these strategies simultaneously. It is signaling openness to some form of negotiation while not fully committing. It is continuing to advance its nuclear program while denying certain capabilities to international inspectors. It is maintaining its proxy networks even as those proxies take serious damage from American strikes. And it is watching American domestic politics very carefully for any sign that the political will for sustained military engagement is weakening. The president's statements about winding down military operations feed directly into that last calculation. When Tehran hears the President of the United States suggesting that military engagement may be coming to an end, the Iranian government is not going to immediately run to a negotiating table and offer concessions. It is going to interpret that as evidence that the pressure may not be sustainable, that the American political will may be softening, and that waiting out the pressure could be a viable strategy. That is a dangerous dynamic. Because if Iran concludes that waiting is viable, it will continue advancing its nuclear program. And if the nuclear program continues advancing, the pressure from Israel and from American hawks to take more decisive military action will grow. and that leads toward a direct confrontation rather than away from one. This is the trap that is embedded in the current communication strategy. Talking publicly about winding down can undermine the pressure that is supposed to be creating the conditions for a diplomatic solution. Now, this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because there is another way to read the president's statements, and this reading is more charitable and arguably more strategically sophisticated, even if it is harder to communicate clearly to a general audience. In some schools of diplomatic and strategic thought, the way to get an adversary to make a deal is to create uncertainty about your intentions. If the adversary knows exactly what you will do and when, they can plan around it. But if the adversary is genuinely uncertain about whether you are going to escalate or de-escalate, they face a harder calculation. The uncertainty itself becomes a form of pressure. On this reading, the president saying "wind down" while the Pentagon builds up is not a contradiction. It is a deliberate ambiguity designed to keep Iran guessing. Are the Americans about to stand down? Are they about to hit us harder? We cannot be sure. Better to make a deal now than to find out the hard way. This is sometimes called the madman theory of diplomacy, a term associated historically with President Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger. The idea is that projecting unpredictability can give a negotiating partner more reason to seek a settlement, because a predictable adversary can be managed and outmaneuvered, but an unpredictable one is harder to game. There is a real historical record of this approach producing results in certain contexts, and it is worth taking seriously as a possible explanation for what we are seeing. But the madman theory also has serious limitations. It works best when there is a clear negotiating channel, when both sides have a basic understanding of what a potential deal looks like, and when the adversary is rational and capable of making strategic calculations. If any of those conditions are not met, unpredictability does not create productive pressure. It creates chaos. And right now, the question of whether there is a genuinely productive negotiating channel between Washington and Tehran is not fully clear. There have been reports of back-channel communications, of intermediaries carrying messages between the two governments, of Omani diplomats playing a facilitating role as they have done before in US-Iran negotiations. But we do not know with confidence what is actually being discussed, what the gap between the two sides' positions is, or whether a deal is genuinely close. The president's statement that the US is getting very close to meeting its goals is either a reflection of genuine progress in those back channels, or it is political messaging designed to shape public perception, or both. Without more detailed information, it is not possible to know for certain. What we can say is this: the structural conditions for a deal are difficult. The US wants Iran to significantly limit its nuclear program and reduce its support for proxies. Iran wants sanctions relief and security guarantees. Both sides have domestic political constraints that make significant concessions politically costly. And the military dynamic, with ongoing US strikes and Iranian proxy activity, makes the diplomatic environment more hostile, not more friendly. That does not mean a deal is impossible. History is full of deals made under incredibly difficult conditions. But it does mean that the road from here to a sustainable agreement is long, complex, and full of potential obstacles. Let us talk about what the Pentagon's continued buildup actually means operationally. Because the details here are important and they tell us something about the military's actual assessment of the threat environment. When the United States deploys additional military assets to a region, it is not doing so randomly or for political show. Military deployments are expensive, logistically complex, and strategically significant. When the Pentagon sends additional forces to the Middle East, even as the president talks about winding down, it is making a professional military judgment that those forces are needed. The types of assets being deployed and the types of strikes being planned give us clues about what the military's actual threat assessment is. If you are planning more air strikes against Houthi targets, you need strike aircraft, munitions, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, and naval platforms to operate from. If you are worried about potential Iranian direct retaliation against U.S. forces or bases, you need missile defense systems, hardened facilities, and quick reaction forces. If you are maintaining the option to strike Iranian nuclear facilities or military infrastructure directly, you need long-range strike capability, including potentially the kind of bunker-busting munitions that only the United States has in sufficient quantity to be effective against hardened underground Iranian nuclear sites. The Pentagon does not maintain all of that capability in position if it genuinely believes the conflict is winding down. It maintains that capability because it has assessed that it may need it. That assessment is based on intelligence that is not fully available to the public, but we can make reasonable inferences. Iran's nuclear program is at a critical stage. Iranian-backed groups remain active across the region. The situation in Gaza, while distinct from the US-Iran dynamic, continues to create conditions that could trigger broader escalation. And Iran has the means and the demonstrated willingness to retaliate against US interests through asymmetric means, cyber attacks, attacks on regional allies, mining of shipping lanes, and activation of proxy forces. In that environment, the military judgment to maintain a robust forward presence is not surprising. It is what you would expect from a professional military that takes its threat assessments seriously. The tension between that military posture and the president's political messaging is real. And managing that tension effectively is one of the core challenges of civilian control of the military in a democracy. The president sets the political direction. The military implements it while maintaining the operational readiness required to protect American interests regardless of what the political direction says on any given day. Usually that tension is managed quietly below the level of public visibility. The fact that it is visible right now, that we can see the gap between presidential messaging and military posture from open-source reporting, is itself noteworthy. It suggests that the gap is wider than normal, or that the coordination between political messaging and military operations is less tight than it typically is. Now let us talk about the broader regional context, because this story does not exist in a vacuum. The Middle East is going through one of its most turbulent periods in decades. The conflict in Gaza has had massive political and social effects throughout the Arab world and beyond. The normalization process between Israel and several Arab states, which was making real progress before October 2023, has been severely disrupted. The Houthis in Yemen, backed by Iran, have been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea, one of the world's most important trade routes, forcing major shipping companies to reroute their vessels around Africa at enormous cost in time and money. Hezbollah in Lebanon, also backed by Iran, has been engaged in ongoing exchanges of fire with Israel. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria have been attacking U.S. military bases. All of this is connected. It is all part of what Iran calls its axis of resistance, a network of allied armed groups stretching from Yemen in the south to Lebanon in the north that Iran uses to project power and create pressure against Israel and the United States without direct Iranian involvement. The axis of resistance strategy has been central to Iranian foreign policy for decades. It allows Iran to be a major regional power player while avoiding the direct military confrontations that would expose Iran's conventional military to American or Israeli firepower, where Iran would be at a severe disadvantage. It gives Iran plausible deniability. It allows Iran to escalate and de-escalate through proxies in ways that give more direct parties off-ramps. The United States, under the current administration, has been striking at the axis of resistance primarily through the Houthi campaign in Yemen. The argument is that by degrading Houthi military capability, the U.S. is reducing Iran's ability to threaten regional security and imposing a cost on Tehran for its proxy strategy. But there is a real question about how effective that strategy is in actually changing Iranian behavior. The Houthis have shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. They have maintained their operational capacity despite taking significant damage from American strikes. They continue to fire missiles and drones toward Israel and to threaten shipping in the Red Sea. The Iran-backed network as a whole has not been significantly degraded. Part of the reason for this is that Iran has been supplying these groups for years, building up stockpiles of weapons, missiles, and drones that are dispersed and hidden in ways that are difficult to fully destroy from the air. You can strike the visible infrastructure. You cannot easily strike every buried weapons cache or every dispersed mobile launcher. This is a fundamental challenge of air power against a dispersed, adaptive adversary. It is a lesson that the United States military has learned in multiple conflicts over the past several decades. Air power is devastating against fixed targets and concentrated forces. It is much less decisive against dispersed, networked, motivated, and adaptive irregular forces. So the military campaign against the Houthis and by extension against Iran's proxy network is achieving real tactical results, but may not be achieving the strategic result of changing Iran's fundamental behavior and calculus. That is a significant problem if the goal is to get Iran to change its behavior rather than simply to punish it for that behavior. Punishment without change is just destruction. And prolonged destruction without strategic progress is exactly the kind of situation that leads to wars that drag on for years without a satisfying conclusion. And what happened next changed the entire calculation. Because here is something that has not gotten nearly enough attention in the coverage of this story. The economic dimension of this conflict is creating a set of pressures that are operating independently of the military and diplomatic dimensions, and those economic pressures are moving faster than either the military campaign or the diplomatic process. Iran is sitting on significant oil reserves. Under normal circumstances, those oil reserves are a source of enormous wealth. But sanctions have dramatically limited Iran's ability to sell that oil on the global market, pushing it to sell through informal channels at steep discounts, primarily to China. That has given China significant leverage over Iran, since China is effectively Iran's economic lifeline under the sanctions regime. This economic relationship between China and Iran is one of the most underappreciated factors in the entire strategic picture. China is not going to support military action against Iran. China benefits economically from buying Iranian oil at below-market prices. China benefits strategically from the distraction that the US-Iran conflict creates for American strategic attention. And China has been deepening its relationship with Iran as part of its broader Belt and Road Initiative and its effort to build an alternative global order that is less dominated by the United States. So any military or diplomatic strategy toward Iran has to account for the fact that China is effectively a third party in this conflict, providing Iran with the economic oxygen it needs to resist American pressure. Without Chinese cooperation, the sanctions regime is less effective, and China has shown no intention of cooperating with American sanctions policy toward Iran, especially in the current environment where US-China relations are themselves deeply strained. This means that the maximum pressure strategy, which depends on economic sanctions to force a change in Iranian behavior, has a structural ceiling. It cannot work fully as long as China is willing to buy Iranian oil and provide Iran with alternative economic relationships. And China will keep doing that as long as it serves China's interests, which it does. This is not a new problem. It is a problem that has been baked into the Iran sanctions strategy for years. But it is worth naming clearly, because it helps explain why maximum pressure has not produced the kind of dramatic change in Iranian behavior that its proponents predicted. The way to solve the China problem in the Iran equation is either to get China to cooperate with sanctions, which requires a level of US-China diplomatic engagement that does not currently exist, or to find a diplomatic solution with Iran that does not depend on sanctions being effective, which means accepting a deal that Iran can live with rather than one that the hardliners in Washington prefer. Neither of those options is easy. Both of them require making choices that are politically difficult domestically. Let us talk about the domestic political dimension in more detail, because this is where the gap between presidential messaging and military reality becomes most understandable. President Trump is operating in a political environment where he faces pressure from multiple directions on the Iran question. On his right flank, there are voices who want a much more aggressive approach to Iran, who see the nuclear program as an existential threat that must be eliminated through force, and who are skeptical of any deal that does not completely dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure and its regional proxy network. These voices include some prominent figures in the foreign policy establishment, in the Israeli government and its American advocates, and in certain corners of the Republican Party. On his other flank, there are voices who are deeply skeptical of foreign military entanglements, who do not want to see the United States get drawn into another prolonged Middle Eastern war, and who believe that the interests of ordinary Americans are better served by focusing on domestic issues than by projecting military power in the Middle East. These voices are also present in the Republican coalition and have grown stronger over the past decade. The president has to navigate between those two pressures while also managing the actual strategic reality on the ground. Talking about winding down is a signal to the skeptics that he is not getting the country into another endless war. Maintaining the military buildup is a signal to the hawks that he is not going soft on Iran. And claiming that the US is getting close to its goals is a message to both groups that the strategy is working, while avoiding the need to specify exactly what the goals are or exactly how close is close. This kind of political message management is not unusual. Leaders have always had to communicate different messages to different audiences simultaneously. But it creates real risks when the messages are contradictory in ways that affect actual strategic behavior, because adversaries, allies, and markets are all trying to read those signals and make their own decisions based on them. Allies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are watching this closely. They have their own complex relationships with Iran. They have normalized relations with Israel in the case of the UAE. They are energy exporters who benefit from high oil prices but worry about the instability that military conflict creates. They want American protection and American deterrence, but they also do not want to be caught in the middle of a direct US-Iran confrontation. Saudi Arabia has been on an interesting diplomatic trajectory. After years of being deeply hostile toward Iran, Saudi Arabia reached a diplomatic agreement brokered by China in 2023 to restore diplomatic relations with Tehran. That agreement was a significant signal that Riyadh was hedging its bets, maintaining its American security relationship while also trying to reduce the direct threat from Iran through diplomacy. The ongoing U.S. military pressure on Iran and its proxies complicates that Saudi-Iranian diplomatic relationship and forces Riyadh into a difficult position. Israel, meanwhile, is the most important ally in this equation from the American perspective. The U.S.-Israel relationship is deep and multidimensional, and American policy toward Iran is inseparable from Israeli security concerns. Israel's government has been consistent and vocal about its belief that Iran's nuclear program represents an existential threat and that military action may ultimately be necessary to stop it. The question of whether and when Israel might strike Iranian nuclear facilities is one of the most consequential questions in the entire strategic picture. An Israeli strike on Iran would almost certainly trigger significant Iranian retaliation, which could in turn trigger American involvement, which could in turn lead to a much broader conflict. This is the escalation scenario that keeps strategic planners and foreign policy experts up at night. The American military buildup in the region is partly about deterring Iranian retaliation and giving the United States the capability to manage the aftermath of an Israeli strike if one occurs. That is not a scenario that Washington is publicly discussing, but it is almost certainly part of the contingency planning. The president's statements about winding down in this context can also be read as a signal to Israel. A message that says, "We have created significant pressure on Iran, we are close to a diplomatic resolution. Do not take unilateral action right now that could blow up a potential deal." But again, the clarity of that signal is muddied by the simultaneous military buildup. Let us take a step back and look at the longer arc of this conflict, because it helps to understand where we are in the historical trajectory. The U.S.-Iran relationship has been defined by hostility since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when Iranian revolutionaries seized the American embassy and held 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days. That foundational trauma has never fully healed. The United States has never fully accepted the Islamic Republic as a legitimate government. Iran has never fully trusted that the United States does not seek to overthrow the Islamic Republic. Those mutual suspicions have shaped everything that has happened between the two countries in the 46 years since. There have been moments that seemed like they might change the trajectory. The nuclear deal negotiated under President Obama and signed in 2015, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or JCPOA, was the most serious attempt in the history of the US-Iran relationship to manage the nuclear issue through diplomacy. Iran agreed to significant restrictions on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. International inspectors verified compliance. For a brief period, it looked like a corner might be turning. Then President Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018, reimposing the sanctions and returning to a maximum pressure strategy. Iran responded by gradually stepping away from the nuclear limits it had accepted, enriching uranium at higher levels, reducing cooperation with inspectors, and advancing its centrifuge technology. The JCPOA's failure, or more precisely, the failure of the political process to sustain the deal, left the nuclear situation significantly worse than it was before the deal was negotiated. Iran today has more nuclear capability than it did in 2015. The enrichment levels are higher, the centrifuges are more advanced, the breakout time is shorter. This is the strategic hole that the current administration has dug itself into. The previous policy of withdrawing from the deal and imposing maximum pressure, a policy that the current administration supported and continues to lean on, produced a nuclear program more advanced than any previous period in the US-Iran standoff. Getting Iran back to a position where its nuclear program is genuinely limited and verifiable now requires getting Iran to give up gains it has made since 2018, which is a much harder ask than the original JCPOA, which required Iran to give up gains it had made before 2015. Iran will demand a much higher price for those concessions. What would that price look like? It would almost certainly involve very significant sanctions relief, security guarantees that the United States takes seriously, some form of American acceptance of Iran's right to a civilian nuclear program including enrichment, and possibly some recognition of Iran's regional political role and the interests of its allies. These are all things that are very hard for an American administration to deliver, especially one that faces domestic pressure from constituencies that want to see Iran weakened and not rewarded. So the path to a deal that actually resolves the nuclear issue is genuinely difficult. And yet the alternative, allowing Iran's nuclear program to continue advancing until either Iran achieves weapons capability or someone strikes the facilities to prevent it, is also deeply problematic. This is the strategic box that defines the Iran problem. There is no easy way out. Every option has serious costs and risks, and the decisions made in the coming months could determine whether this situation resolves through diplomacy or escalates into a direct military confrontation. The president's claim that the US is getting close to its goals and his floating of a wind down can be understood in this context as an attempt to create political conditions for a deal, to signal that enough pressure has been applied to give Iran a face-saving way to come to the table. That is a reasonable diplomatic impulse. The question is whether the execution matches the impulse. And right now, the gap between the presidential messaging and the Pentagon's posture is making that execution look incoherent rather than strategic. Let us talk about the economic stakes because they are significant and they affect Americans directly. Oil prices are highly sensitive to tensions in the Middle East. Any significant escalation in the US-Iran conflict, particularly anything that threatens the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes, would cause oil prices to spike sharply. That means higher gasoline prices for American consumers, higher costs for businesses that depend on energy, and broader inflationary pressure that the Federal Reserve would have to respond to. The United States has become much less dependent on Middle Eastern oil over the past decade thanks to the shale revolution. But the global oil market is interconnected. American oil companies price their product at global rates. So even though the U.S. is a major oil producer, American consumers still feel the impact of global oil price spikes. Higher oil prices are also politically damaging for any administration. American voters are deeply sensitive to gas prices. They check the price every time they fill up their tank. When gas prices rise, presidential approval ratings typically fall. So there is a direct line from the US-Iran conflict to the political fortunes of the administration. This creates yet another incentive for the president to project calm and talk about winding down, because the perception of de-escalation, even if the military reality is more complicated, can help stabilize oil markets and prevent the kind of price spike that would be politically costly. Financial markets more broadly also respond to geopolitical risk. When the risk of a major military confrontation in the Middle East rises, investors move money into safe haven assets and away from riskier investments. That can have ripple effects through stock markets, bond markets, and currency markets globally. The United States economy right now is navigating a complex environment with elevated interest rates, concerns about growth, and persistent inflation in some sectors. A major geopolitical shock from the Middle East would not be welcome at this moment from an economic standpoint. So the economic stakes reinforce the political incentives for projecting de-escalation, even if the strategic reality on the ground does not yet support it. But here is the danger in that calculation. If the market calms down based on presidential messaging about winding down, and then the situation on the ground actually escalates because the military buildup continues and Iran does not change its behavior, the economic shock could be larger and more disruptive than it would have been if expectations had not been managed down. Markets do not like being misled, and the gap between managed down expectations and the actual strategic reality could produce a sudden, sharp repricing of risk. That is why consistency between messaging and reality matters not just strategically but economically. Gaps between what leaders say and what is actually happening tend to close one way or another. And they tend to close in ways that are disruptive. Now let us talk about what the possible outcomes look like from here, because the situation is not static and the choices made in the coming weeks and months will matter enormously. One possible outcome is a genuine diplomatic agreement. Iran and the United States, possibly mediated by Oman or another third party, reach a deal that limits Iran's nuclear program in exchange for significant sanctions relief. The military pressure has convinced Iran that the cost of continued confrontation is too high. The economic pressure from sanctions has created enough internal strain that the Iranian government decides a deal is better than the alternative. The deal may not be perfect from either side's perspective, but it is enough to stabilize the situation and reduce the immediate risk of a broader conflict. This is the outcome the president seems to be suggesting is close. If it is genuinely close, the current strategy may be working even if the execution looks messy from the outside. A second possible outcome is continued stalemate. The military pressure continues, the diplomatic channels produce talks but not a deal, The nuclear program continues to advance, and the situation remains in a dangerous equilibrium that could break in either direction. This is perhaps the most likely outcome in the near term, and it is not a stable one. Stalemates of this kind tend to resolve eventually, either through diplomacy or through conflict. A third possible outcome is escalation. Something happens, a miscalculation, an incident, an Iranian proxy attack that kills American service members, an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, a closure of the Strait of Hormuz that triggers a rapid escalation beyond the current level of conflict. The military buildup the Pentagon is planning would then be justified as necessary preparation, but the situation would have moved beyond the wind-down that the president has been discussing. A fourth possible outcome is that Iran achieves nuclear weapons capability before any of the other dynamics resolve. If Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, the entire strategic picture changes in profound ways. A nuclear-armed Iran changes the deterrence calculation for every country in the region. It creates pressure for Saudi Arabia and other regional states to pursue their own nuclear programs. It makes Israeli military action against Iran dramatically more costly. And it fundamentally changes the leverage that economic sanctions and military pressure have, because nuclear-armed states cannot be pressured the same way that non-nuclear states can. This fourth outcome is the one that the hawks in Washington and Jerusalem are most focused on preventing, and it is why the urgency around the Iran situation is so high right now. The breakout timeline that the intelligence community has assessed puts Iran at a point where the window for preventing weapons capability through conventional means is genuinely narrow. That urgency is part of what makes the current moment so consequential. Against that backdrop, the president's claim that the U.S. is getting close to its goals needs to be evaluated carefully. If the goal is preventing nuclear weapons capability, getting close is not enough. You either prevent it or you do not. There is no partial success in nuclear non-proliferation. This is why the framing of winding down military operations while the nuclear clock is ticking is so difficult to square. Winding down before the nuclear issue is genuinely resolved means accepting a situation where Iran retains the infrastructure and the enriched uranium to build a bomb on relatively short notice. That may be an acceptable outcome to some if it is paired with robust verification and monitoring. It is not an acceptable outcome to others who believe that any Iranian nuclear capability is unacceptable regardless of formal commitments. This fundamental disagreement about what an acceptable outcome looks like is not just a disagreement between the United States and Iran. It is a disagreement within Washington itself, between those who would accept a managed nuclear program with strong verification and those who will not accept any Iranian enrichment at any level. And that internal Washington disagreement is part of what makes the mixed signals we are seeing so hard to resolve. The president may be navigating between those two camps within his own coalition, trying to signal enough toward a deal to keep the diplomatic track alive, while simultaneously signaling enough toughness to not alienate those who want a more maximalist approach. Managing that internal political dynamic while simultaneously managing an adversary that is watching every signal carefully and making its own calculations accordingly is one of the most difficult diplomatic and political tasks imaginable. Now let us talk about Iran's internal dynamics because they matter enormously to how this situation evolves. Iran is not a monolith. Like any complex society, it contains multiple competing factions, interests, and views on the right path forward. There are hardliners within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Supreme Leadership who are deeply opposed to any compromise with the United States, and who see the nuclear program as an essential element of the Islamic Republic's survival and identity. There are more pragmatic figures who believe that economic recovery and engagement with the international community are essential for the regime's long-term stability. And there is a large segment of the Iranian population that is exhausted by decades of sanctions and isolation and would welcome a return to normalcy. The balance of power among these factions has shifted over time. The JCPOA was negotiated under President Rouhani, who represented a more pragmatic faction. But Rouhani's successor, President Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash in 2024, was aligned with the hardliners. The current president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is considered relatively moderate, at least by Iranian standards, but operates within constraints set by Supreme Leader Khamenei, who has ultimate authority over major decisions including the nuclear program and foreign policy. Khamenei has been genuinely ambiguous on the nuclear question over the years, issuing religious rulings against nuclear weapons while presiding over a program that has moved steadily toward weapons capability. His public statements suggest that he sees the nuclear program as a strategic asset that gives Iran leverage, not necessarily as something Iran intends to convert into actual weapons in the immediate term, though the capability to do so quickly is itself a form of deterrence. Whether Khamenei would authorize a deal that genuinely and verifiably limited the nuclear program depends on whether he believes the security guarantees offered are credible, and whether the economic benefits are significant enough to justify the political cost of being seen to back down under American pressure. The track record here is not encouraging. The United States withdrew from the last deal it made with Iran. That gives Khamenei and every Iranian official a very strong argument that American security guarantees cannot be trusted because the next American president could simply tear up the deal again. This is a structural problem with American credibility in negotiations that is separate from any particular administration's intentions. Unless there is a way to make the commitments more durable and less susceptible to being reversed by a future president, whether through congressional ratification, international treaty status, or some other mechanism, Iran has a rational basis for skepticism about any American commitment. This is one of the hardest nuts to crack in the entire Iran diplomatic equation, and it is rarely discussed with sufficient seriousness in the media coverage of this issue. The Obama administration tried to address this partly by making the JCPOA a multilateral agreement endorsed by the UN Security Council, which gave it more international legitimacy and made it harder to simply walk away from without significant diplomatic cost. That did not prevent the US withdrawal in 2018. But it did create a record that other parties to the agreement, including the European Union, China, and Russia, used to continue upholding their side of the bargain for some time after the US left. Any new deal would face the same structural problem, and Iran's negotiators know this. Which means that if Iran is going to make major concessions in a new deal, it will want very significant economic benefits delivered up front before it has to make the most difficult concessions. That is exactly the kind of structure that is politically hardest for an American administration to sell domestically. You can see why this is so difficult. The structural problems are not simple misunderstandings or failures of communication. They are deeply rooted in the history of the relationship, the domestic politics of both countries, and the fundamental strategic interests of two governments that have been adversaries for nearly 5 decades. And yet, the alternative to finding some way through these structural problems is a conflict that nobody on either side genuinely wants to fight at full scale. Let us talk about what a wind down that is actually strategic would look like, because it is worth thinking about what success in this situation would actually mean. A genuine, strategically sound wind down of U.S. military operations in the context of the Iran conflict would require several things to be in place simultaneously. First, there would need to be a credible diplomatic framework in place or clearly in progress that gives the military restraint strategic meaning. You wind down because you are creating space for diplomacy, not because you are giving up. Second, there would need to be a clear definition of what the military achieved, what goals were met, what Iranian behavior changed as a result of the pressure. Third, there would need to be a monitoring and enforcement mechanism to verify that Iran upholds its commitments if a deal is reached. And fourth, there would need to be a clear statement of what would trigger a return to pressure or escalation if Iran fails to maintain its commitments. Without all 4 of those elements in place, a wind down is not strategic. It is just a change in posture that leaves the underlying problems unresolved. Right now, from what is publicly visible, it is not clear that all 4 of those elements are in place. There are reports of diplomatic activity. There is no publicly announced framework or even the outline of a potential deal. There has been no clear accounting of what military pressure achieved in terms of changed Iranian behavior. And there has been no clear statement of red lines for what would trigger resumed or escalated pressure. That does not mean those things are not happening in the back channels. It is possible, and many experienced observers believe it is likely, that more is happening behind the scenes than is visible publicly. But the public messaging does not convey a comprehensive strategic picture. And in the absence of that comprehensive picture, the president's wind-down statements look more like political messaging than strategic communication, which creates the perception problems and the strategic ambiguity problems that we have already discussed. Let us zoom out even further for a moment and think about this in the context of American grand strategy. The United States has been engaged in the Middle East at high levels for more than 20 years since the September 11 attacks. Trillions of dollars have been spent. Thousands of American lives have been lost. The strategic results, honestly assessed, have been mixed at best. Iraq went through a prolonged civil war after the American invasion, eventually stabilizing but producing a government with deep ties to Iran. Afghanistan collapsed back to Taliban rule after 2 decades of American engagement. Libya descended into chaos after the NATO intervention. Syria's civil war produced enormous human suffering and gave Iran and Russia significant influence. The lesson that many Americans have drawn from this history is that direct military intervention in the Middle East does not produce the outcomes it promises and comes at enormous cost. This lesson has influenced public opinion and political discourse significantly. It is part of why there is genuine public skepticism about another prolonged military engagement in the region. At the same time, the argument for sustained American engagement in the Middle East, even if the form of that engagement needs to change, is that the alternative is not a peaceful Middle East. It is a Middle East dominated by Iran, Russia, and China, with all the implications that has for global energy security, for the security of American allies, and for the broader global order that American power has underwritten for decades. This debate about the appropriate scope and form of American engagement in the Middle East is one of the genuinely important strategic debates of our time. And the Iran situation is at the center of it. The president's positioning, tough on Iran but hinting at wind down, maximum pressure but maybe close to goals, military buildup but considering de-escalation, can be read as an attempt to navigate between these competing strategic philosophies rather than fully committing to either. Whether that navigation is successful depends ultimately on whether the conditions for a genuine diplomatic resolution materialize. If they do, the strategy will look brilliant in hindsight. If they do not, the strategy will look like it was trying to be all things to all people and ended up being none of them. That is the fundamental uncertainty we are living with right now. And it is why this moment deserves careful, serious attention. Now, let us return to where we started and talk about what the bigger picture really looks like. The gap between the president saying wind down and the Pentagon saying build up is not just a communication failure. It is a symptom of a deeper strategic tension that has not been resolved. The tension between the desire to avoid prolonged military engagement and the reality that the strategic problems with Iran cannot be solved by simply stepping back from engagement. The tension between political messaging designed to manage domestic audiences and the strategic communication required to influence adversary behavior. The tension between short-term political incentives and long-term strategic requirements. These tensions are not unique to this administration. They have been present in American Iran policy through multiple administrations of both parties. But they are particularly visible and particularly consequential right now because the nuclear clock is ticking, the military pressure is high, and the window for a diplomatic resolution before events force a harder choice is narrowing. What does this mean for ordinary Americans? It means that the Iran situation is not going away. The next few months are going to be consequential. The outcome of this standoff will affect gas prices, will affect the risk of American military casualties, will affect the security of American allies, and will affect the broader state of global security in ways that matter to people's daily lives. It means that the quality of information and analysis available to the public about what is actually happening matters enormously. When presidential messaging and military reality diverge, citizens deserve analysis that explains the gap rather than just amplifying the messaging. It means that the choices made by political leaders and military commanders in the coming weeks are genuinely high stakes, and that those choices should be made with clarity, honesty, and strategic coherence rather than with an eye primarily on short-term political optics. The United States is, as it has been for more than 40 years, locked in a conflict with Iran that neither side can fully win and neither side seems to know how to end. The current moment is one of the more acute phases of that conflict. The signals are mixed, the stakes are high, the window for a diplomatic off-ramp may be narrow. That is the honest picture. It is more complicated than any single headline. It does not resolve neatly into a victory or a defeat. It requires sustained attention and analytical clarity to understand. And that, more than anything else, is why this story matters and why it deserves the serious, careful attention that we have tried to give it today. The next time you see a headline about Trump floating the idea of winding down the Iran conflict, or about the Pentagon expanding its military presence in the region, Hold both those things in your head at the same time. Do not let one cancel out the other. They are both true, and the gap between them is where the real story lives. The real story is about a conflict that is simultaneously being escalated and managed, about political pressures that are pulling in different directions from strategic requirements, about an adversary that is calculating constantly and watching every signal, about allies with their own agendas and red lines, about economic stakes that affect ordinary Americans directly, about a nuclear clock that is not pausing for political messaging, and about a strategic landscape that is genuinely dangerous and genuinely consequential. That story is not simple, but it is important. And the more clearly you understand it, the better equipped you are to evaluate what you hear about it from politicians, from media, and from everyone who has something to gain from simplifying it. Stay engaged with this story. Ask the questions that the messaging does not answer. Hold leaders accountable to clarity and consistency. And do not let the complexity of the situation become an excuse for giving up on understanding it. Because the people who understand this situation are better positioned to demand the kind of leadership that the situation requires. One final thought. The history of US-Iran relations is, at its core, a story of two countries that have never found a way to coexist without hostility. The Islamic Republic was built in opposition to American power. American policy has been shaped by the trauma of the hostage crisis and a fundamental rejection of the legitimacy of the Iranian regime. Those foundational facts have made every attempt at normalization politically fraught on both sides. But the history of international relations is also full of examples of countries that found ways to manage their differences, not by becoming friends, but by finding frameworks for coexistence that served their mutual interests better than endless conflict. The United States and China. The United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the United States and Vietnam in more recent decades. None of those were simple or clean. All of them required accepting realities that neither side loved, but they served the interest of avoiding catastrophic conflict while each side pursued its goals through other means. Whether the United States and Iran can find that kind of framework remains to be seen. The current moment is a test of whether the political will and the strategic clarity exist to make that kind of framework possible. The signals we are seeing right now are not encouraging about the clarity, but the situation is not yet beyond the point of no return. And as long as it is not beyond the point of no return, there is reason to take seriously the possibility that the outcome of this story could be better than the most pessimistic readings suggest. That has to be worth something. The alternative to trying is a path toward a conflict that would be enormously costly for the United States, for Iran, for the region, and for the world. Keep paying attention, keep asking questions, and demand the kind of clear-eyed, fact-based analysis that this moment requires. If this kind of careful, independent political analysis is what you want more of, subscribe and make sure you never miss an episode. This channel exists to cut through the noise and give you the real picture on the stories that matter most. Share this video with someone who is following the Iran situation closely, because this kind of context is exactly what is missing from most of the coverage out there. And drop a comment below with one specific question you have about the Iran conflict, something you want to understand more clearly. Your questions help shape what this channel covers, and the most important questions in the comments often become the foundation for the next deep dive. The conversation does not end when the video does. It continues in the comments, and it continues when you share what you learned with people in your life. That is how independent political analysis actually makes a difference.